Hey everybody, happy Monday. It's Spencer Hakimian and welcome back to another episode of What's Moving Your Money with Forbes. We have a very busy episode today. We're going to be covering Trump firing the Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We're also going to be talking about some weird quirks that are beginning to show up in the government published CPI inflation price index. And we're going to talk about the dispute between the United States and India, what this means for the overall trade wars with all the countries at this point in time, what this specifically means for Indian and Americans' relationship, and how Trump may have good intentions here, but the wrong plan of action. So sit back tight, get ready, and I hope you guys enjoy. So the big news on Friday was that after the labor report came out, and it was a pretty soft jobs report, Trump decided to fire Dr. Erika McEntarfer, who was a civil servant that was serving on the BLS. Now, this is a really insignificant job. I pretty much assume that almost none of you have heard of this woman's name up until yesterday. And while they do very noble and very important work, this is not someone that can easily put his hands on the scale and move things. This is a very nonpartisan, very bland statistical reporting job. It's not front cover news ever. You rarely hear about them. You don't know who's working under them. And their job is simply to report the revisions. Now, Trump fired her seemingly on the premise that in recent months and years, there has been an increasing size of revisions to this data. And given the fact that there are all these revisions, this is somebody that is worthy of being relieved of her duties because she is simply not performing her job. And look, to an extent, I agree with Trump's logic here. I've been sounding the horn about how off government published job data was relative to just, let's say, the ADP, which is a private payroll report that comes out. Or if you look at CPI versus Trueflation, you get a similar outlook. Again, CPI is also published by the BLS. But could you imagine if this report came out and it was positively revised upward, aka if they originally thought jobs were 150,000 and jobs ended up actually being 300,000? You think Trump would be firing this woman? I don't think so. Let me know what you think. By the way, I don't think Biden didn't fire anyone. But again, so when you want to protect the integrity of the data, I appreciate that argument. But that argument has to work both ways. You can't just pretend you want to protect the integrity of the data when data is revised to the downside. So look, that's what I've been thinking about this lately. And just as a general thought, I think he's got the right idea here. But I think his motives are quite nefarious, and I think he's doing this only because he is negatively impacting himself. Now let's go to the second order effect, because this is frankly more important. It is strongly assumed that the next commissioner of the BLS is going to be someone that Trump handpicks, and we can reasonably assume with that handpick, there's going to become an expectation that more positive data has to be shown about the economy with this administration. They have to massage the data. They're going to have to tweak the data. They're going to have to, squeeze the data. They're going to have to put their fingers on the scale in terms of the weights they put on this data. Whatever they have to do, they're going to have to do something to make this data look a little bit better for the current administration, for the Trump administration. Now, there is essentially no precedence for this in the United States of nonpartisan data becoming just so clouded by partisanship and by clear motives to make something appear like what it's not. I'm sure you guys can all get where I'm trying to get at with this. But we do have some 21st century examples of when countries try to either make their employment numbers look better, or their inflation numbers look better, or their GDP look better, or their national debt look less extended than it actually was. And in every single instance, it ended in disaster. Utter, outright, unquestioned disaster. Let's get into some of these things. In the mid-2010s, Argentina was dealing with a massive inflation crisis, and they began firing anyone that was reporting inflation on behalf of the government that was showing true numbers. And what ended up happening was not only did the private sector not believe the new government numbers that supposedly showed inflation improving, but because it was assumed that there was so much lying and so much monkey business in all these numbers, bond yields in Argentina actually rose in excess of what they should have risen given that inflation, because frankly, no one could have trusted them. You can look also at a country like Egypt. They also had a currency problem stemming from inflation, and they did a similar thing. They made their inflation inflation data appear much better than it actually was. And what ended up happening is that so much of the contracts in Egypt have an inflation kicker given to them every single year to match inflation. So what ended up happening was that people on retirement plans, on pensions in Egypt, ended up collecting less than they really should have because inflation was being underreported, and it led to a recession because people's purchasing power was falling in real terms because the government was underreporting inflation. Now, Argentina and Egypt are, not stable economies relative to the United States, but we can even look at China for a very fascinating example here. In China, for years, they overreported GDP growth and underreported debt growth. And what ended up becoming the final effect of all of that fluff, all of that exaggeration, they got the biggest property crisis in their history that came out of this. Developers were under the premise that population and growth was much higher than it was. At the same time, loans were extended that shouldn't have been extended because banks appeared to be less leveraged than they really were. And at the end, the market finally caught on in 2021 and 2022 and figured it out. And China is paying a significant price for that dishonesty. So look, this might not happen in the United States, but it's clearly the trend that we're going in. Right? We can always change it, but it's clearly the trend that we're going in. And history shows you don't gain much from doing this because frankly, market participants, the private sector is too smart, and they'll see through the lies and they'll punish the government for those lies in the form of higher borrowing costs, lower economic growth, less investment, less growth all around. Now, one other thing that's really alarming is since we got an initiative in the United States government to become more efficient and to lay off non-critical employees, some sectors, some places like the BLS have had to cut back on their data collection. So the inflation report that comes out monthly, the CPI that the BLS collects, it went from 95% pure data collection and 5% estimation at the end of last year to just at July 4th of this year, it is down to 66% actual data collection and 33% estimates. 1/3 of inflation right now is being estimated. I'm not kidding. Go on my Twitter, go on my TikTok, go on my YouTube page, go on the Forbes videos that we posted before we talk about this. 1/3 of CPI is now being estimated. That is not an accurate way of measuring CPI. I always talk myself about how I just don't see how inflation is 2.5%. I live a life. I have housing costs, I have food costs, I have health insurance costs, I have childcare costs. All my costs are rising significantly higher than 2.5% year over year. I want you guys to comment in your personal lives. What is the inflation rate that you are actually experiencing? Almost no one that I talk to is experiencing 2-3% inflation. Personally, the people I'm talking to are experiencing between 5 and 10% annual inflation. 5, 6, 7, sometimes up to 10, some people more, some people a little bit less. But I want to know what you guys are seeing in terms of all of this inflation. Now let's get into the India and US trade dispute very quickly here. So India was threatened with even more tariffs over the weekend due to the fact that Trump said that they are buying Russian oil and they are supporting the Russian war machine, and this is in violation of American policy to not allow Russia's war machine to grow. And because of all of this, Trump is threatening something called secondary sanctions. Sanctions on top of previous, secondary tariffs, I should say, on top of previous tariffs to raise all of these prices. Now, again, I personally quite agree with President Trump on this one topic. I agree we should not be allowing Russia to fund its war machine by selling energy products to countries around the world, particularly countries like India that are an ally of ours, right? It's not fair that the US, NATO, the Europeans, the Canadians, we're doing so much to weaken Russia, and then some of our other allies are funding it via oil purchases. But with that being said, there are many more strategic, targeted, accurate, pinpoint ways to punish the Indians for buying Russian oil than to to tariff their entire economy. Tariffs are a blunt tool. If you tariff iPhone manufacturing in India, that's not going to stop the purchasing of Russian oil. You can do direct things about Russian oil. You can make it harder to ship it. You can make it harder to settle in dollars or whatever you want to do. But in my opinion, there have to be more pinpoint tools than these blunt, sharp, wide tools like tariffs. Now, particularly with India, India is, in my opinion, the most critical country in the world at this point. Why do I say that? Because they're the one major country in the world that still has not picked their side decisively in Cold War 2.0 between the United States and China. The Europeans are with the Americans, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Russians are with the Chinese. India is the one country, and you can maybe say Saudi Arabia and Qatar, although they lean a little bit more towards the United States because of security reasons. India is one of the only major countries that has not decisively picked a side. And the more we excessively punish the Indians for things like tariffs, for things of that nature, the more we push them towards the Chinese, and that would be a massive loss. India is the fastest growing economy in the world. It's the fastest growing major population center in the world. As an example, Apple is setting up shops in India to produce their iPhones in the event that China invades Taiwan and they will no longer be allowed to produce those iPhones in China. So I think as we work with India, we should be strong in our beliefs. We should be strong and firm in our belief that they should not be buying Russian oil. But we should be going at it in a very select and careful way as to not excessively punish someone that we realistically need as an ally. I am a practicer of realpolitik, which is something that Henry Kissinger termed in the 70s, and it essentially means that as you go about your foreign affairs, you should keep in mind, as you try to improve the world based on your moral understanding, keep in mind practical realities. I believe with India, we need to be practicing a little bit more realpolitik here. Yes, it is noble and it is righteous that we do not want them buying Russian oil and funding their war effort against the Ukrainians. But at the same time, if we punish the entire Indian economy and the American economy just to stop them from purchasing that oil, are we taking it too far? Can we be a little bit more measured with our response? I think so. Please let me know what you guys think. I can't wait to see you guys tomorrow for our next episode. Have a good one.